And you're live.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. Probably some of you are actually in the UK, where Martin is joining us, 9 o'clock in the evening. Is it still light there?
No, it's very dark now. So yes,
Uh,
definitely evening.
Amazing. We saw, we had the supermoon here on, I don't know if you saw it, but I don't, but anyway, Monday night was extraordinary with the August supermoon. Did you have that same experience?
Yes, well, my wife saw it, but I was busy working, so I missed it. But
Wow.
it's pretty striking.
It really is beautiful. So, for those of you who don't know Martin, whom I've known for forever, probably at least 30 years, he is the recipient of the Crime Writers Association Diamond Dagger Award, which is their sort of accolade, greatest person sort of award. And Martin was chairman of the Crime Writers Association, but he has now let that go, but he is still president of the Detection Club, and his distinguished earlier, his distinguished forebears in that role: G.K. Chesterton, Dorothy Sayers, Agatha Christie, Harry Keating, Simon Brett, and I'm missing one.
Julian Simmons.
Thank you, Julian Simmons. So I mean, it's a terrific. Um, it's not a public. You have to be invited to join the Detection Club. I've been lucky enough to attend a few events as guest of various authors. Peter Lovesey, I think, was the first to invite me to go to it, and it's really a thrill. I was actually there the night that Simon Brett was initiated and
Oh,
saw the
wow.
whole ritual.
Wow.
Remember? It was at the Savoy. Do you remember?
That was a long time before I joined, but I was invited as a guest to the Savoy by Robert Barnard, who's a good friend of mine, and that was an exciting experience just to go as a guest. And Francis Fifield and Lindsay Davis were initiated that night, but I never dreamed that I would one day become a member, let alone become president. So
I
an
know, it's
absolute
so
thrill. Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, booksellers don't get to do this, but my fondest memory of the whole thing, aside from going, it was for Ellis Peters' Diamond Dagger, and the Detection Club met right before the ceremony so that's when Peter Lovesey invited me to go to the Detection Club, and then I got to go. And Edith and I got very drunk on champagne before we went to the award ceremony. So it was really kind of risky. But at the Savoy, Lindsay Davis took me as her guest. And my fondest memory of it, aside from the ritual, was sitting in the women's bathroom with P.D. James, who needed a break. And the two of us had like a 15-minute visit in the middle of the club meeting. And that was probably the most time I ever spent with her one-on-one. On another occasion, Harry Keating and Sheila, his wife, had us for dinner with Phyllis and a British crime writer. It might have been Gerald Seymour. Does that sound right? I'm trying to remember. It was another friend of theirs who was a very popular thriller writer, but of an older generation.
Yeah, it's possible. He's somebody I've only met once, very briefly myself, so I don't really know him. But and he's not in the Detection Club. But hopefully you will come again, Barbara, when you're next in England.
Well, I missed you when I went in June to Capital Crimes in London, but you were swanning around somewhere else.
I was doing Bodies from the Library, which is the annual event run by a team of volunteers, but it's held at the British Library on a Saturday in June, and it's great fun. It's many talks about different aspects of the heritage of crime fiction. So that's one to keep in mind for the future.
Well, I will. I'll tell you right now that Capital Crimes is meeting in the middle of June. So possibly if you have any influence, you could prevent the British Library talk and Capital Crimes.
I think the dates are all fixed now, so
We'll see. Anyway, Martin is also the editor of the British Library Crime Classics, which is a marvelous series published in the US by Poison Pen Press, which is now part of Source Books, which is part of Random House. So multiple layers there, but I do think that it is a brilliant series. And during the pandemic, we noticed at the store, and I'm sure other places did as well, that the sale of classics rose dramatically when people had time to read those books they always meant to read or never discovered. Was that Is that your impression that it was also true in
Oh
the UK?
yes, definitely. The pandemic certainly had a big impact on reading habits. Reading went up for obvious reasons. I think it's the figures have stayed up as well by and large. So it's been despite all the terrible things associated with the pandemic, from the point of view of books and the point of view of some of the older books, it there has been the occasional cloud along with the silver linings of more stuff to read, more time to read. And the crime classics have been going now for 10 years
Mhm.
and just over. And they're still selling phenomenally well. I still get a huge amount of emails from people all over the world who read them and enjoy them. So that's very gratifying. And yesterday, I had an exciting experience, which I'll tell you about. You're the first person outside. Well, now everybody who's watching this will know. But I went up to attend the unveiling of a plaque to the author known as E.C.R. Lorac, an old house in Lunesdale in Lancashire, a beautiful old house in the middle of the countryside. And it's quite fantastic, I think, that a writer who was pretty much completely forgotten, except by a small handful of us, now has a plaque dedicated to her memory. And there's a lot of interest in Lorac in particular. She's probably the #1 bestseller nowadays in the crime classic series. The books are very, very popular, and the setting. The books are set in various places, but several of them are set in Lunesdale, in Lancashire, where she lived the last 15 years of her life, and it was quite a poignant occasion. The plaque was unveiled by a lady who knew Lorac when she was a small girl and lived in the cottage next door. So that was rather wonderful and quite a testament to the power of the crime classic series, I think.
Well, not only that, but you actually, one of your earlier books, I'm trying to remember, was called The Mystery in White, was an enormous, bestseller, certainly a UK Sunday Times
Yeah,
huge bestseller.
that's true. It was massive. That was the first Christmas. It was Christmas, yeah, Christmas 10 years ago. And the series had been going for a little while in 2013, but then it began with Victorian mysteries. And my arrival on the scene coincided with the decision to use the railway poster covers, which is so attractive. And the first books to use that kind of artwork were the first two by John Bude, an author who was, again, pretty much forgotten, out of print for 70 years. And all of a sudden, the sales went up through the roof. And of course, I'd like to think it's the wonderful introductions, but of course, it was the combination of the fabulous covers which attract the booksellers, and then the great stories that so people buy the books, they start reading them, and then, yeah, these stories are really good. We may have not known about this writer in the past, but once we have the chance, once the books are available, it's a great opportunity to read something that takes us back to a different time. And of course, that ability to have a bit of agreeable escapism was particularly attractive during the pandemic. And of course, with everything else going on in the world, it still is, I think. So that's part of the reason for the continued
Well, I,
success.
I think you're right. I think also, don't forget that the bar of what is historical fiction has moved during our lifetimes. When I started the store in 1989, the 1920s were barely part of historical fiction. And I realized to my horror last year, when Laurie King wrote a book, that the 1970s have
Yeah,
become where, the bar is drawn. Roughly 50 years is
yeah,
what's going on. So the British Library crime classics, many of them are from the 1930s, 40s into the 50s. And so they're not only classics, but they are historical fiction, although when they were written, they were certainly contemporary. But that's true of Agatha Christie and Sayers and so forth. Now we think of them as classics and looking back, but when they wrote them for their contemporaries. Who is the author of the book I was referring to, the giant bestseller?
Jefferson Farjan,
That's it, Farjan. And what was the title of it?
Mystery in White.
So it was The Mystery in White. Okay. And you've done a couple of others by him, but I don't think they ever achieved the same dramatic sales level as The Mystery in White.
No, that was a special book because, of course, it was a Christmas book. There was snow on the cover. So now at Christmas, when you go into the bookshop and you see all the books with snow on the cover, it's really a kind of tribute act to Mystery in White. Um, and, and it is important to say that although the sales of that book were terrific, it was really the John Bude where the steep climb really began.
Right.
That was the turning point, and it was quite a dramatic change, as I say, from what had happened previously with the sales, which had pretty much flatlined. And certainly when I was asked to write those first two introductions for the two Bude books, it was just a one-off project because it didn't look as though there'd be any more. It was just the advanced sales because of the covers that kind of institutionalized the series, and so more books followed, which was great.
Well, they certainly have. So Martin, as you'll gather from this, is not only the editor of the British Library Crime Classics, but he writes introductions to many, not most of the books, but he also is the anthologizer because he has edited or put together, selected, I guess is the word, stories that have gone into themed collections. And there have been a whole bunch of those, some of them Christmas themed, indeed. And, you know, some of them, it's amazing how well the British Railway posters have fit this project. I mean, you have, you know, like Murder on the Riviera or whatever, and there's a magical poster. And, you know, I've always been impressed. We also, as a result of this, Poison Pen Press, when Robert, my husband, and I still owned it before we sold it to Source Books, started the Library of Congress Crime Classics on the theory that if the British Library, you know, had a series, the Library of Congress should. But there doesn't exist in the Library of Congress a collection that works as well as the railway posters. I mean, they have, you know, images and so forth, but I don't think they've achieved the it ties everything together that the railway posters, you know, are in color and in design and so forth.
Yeah, and then the nostalgic feel, and of course the British Library owns the copyright to those posters, because the British Library was originally part of the British Museum,
Ah,
and it became a separate entity in the 70s. But the railway posters were part of the library collection, so they have the right to use them. And of course, it was a great idea. The guy at the library at that time, he's no longer there now, but the guy who deserves the credit is a guy called Robert Davis, and he had worked in art publishing, and it was his idea to use these covers, and it's his idea to ask me to write a couple of introductions, and you know, the rest, as they say, is history. It's great.
right. Well, we do have a collection, actually all the ones that are currently in print, although a few have dropped out, of the British Library Crime Classics at the Poison Pen, published by Poison Pen Press, and also the Library of Congress Crime Classics. But we're actually here to talk about, because Martin, who is a tireless worker and now retired from his law firm, and I can only conclude that they worked you to death in your law practice, because otherwise you would never have this work ethic. Anyway, this is the fourth book in his Rachel Savern series, and I had to say that you really unleashed your inner Gothic in this one. And one of my questions is, did you actually practice with a guillotine, which turns out to be the murder weapon, but Martin describes it so accurately that I felt like he must have visited somewhere where there's a working model.
Yeah, there are various headless people now as a result of some mishaps. Um, uh, I certainly did research it, but not in a practical sense. And as you know, the fiction, it's made up, but you want, particularly in historical fiction, you want there to be authenticity, because the minute you slip up, people will be disappointed, and of course they'll be very quick to point out where you've slipped up. So I do spend a lot of time on the research, going around the locations, for instance. Don't necessarily drink all the cocktails that are mixed in the books, but I read up all about them and learn that way. Study the Savoy cocktail book, that sort of thing. Checking things out is very enjoyable. It's very interesting. It's very fascinating because it's a fascinating period in British society, but it's also necessary for the story, because the story comes first and foremost and first and last. But unless you have that element of authenticity in the small details, the story, I think, won't work quite as well, because the reader won't suspend disbelief as readily. And of course, that's what you need in a mystery that's quite dramatic. Lots of stuff happening, lots of crimes, lots of mystery. You want that to be counterpointed, I think, with something that's believable and authentic, and that's where the detail comes in.
So for those of you who may have bought a book called Sepulchral Street, that is in fact the UK title for The House on Graveyard Lane. So, to save you from being puzzled, it is a different book. And the newest one, you have one coming, I think, in September, do you not? In the UK. And what's the title of that one?
The title of that is Hemlock Bay. That's the new book, which is published in Britain in about 3 weeks' time.
Right. And so we have copies coming from London that Martin has signed for us. So we're excited about that. Is it another Rachel Savernake, or is it part of your life series?
No, it's Rachel Savernake, although she does go up, not quite to the Lake District, but she does go in that direction up to the Lancashire coast. And she goes to the seaside in Hemlock Bay. What could possibly go wrong? So that was a book that was tremendous fun to write and to research. I based Hemlock Bay on an area that I explored extensively last summer, and it was great fun. So I'm looking forward to that publication in the UK, as well as what is now the House on Graveyard Lane in the States right now.
Right. It is just out, in point of fact, The House on Graveyard Lane. The series I referred to earlier, the first book in it was called The Coffin Trail, and there were several sequels, and they were set up in the Lake Country with an interesting pair of sleuths. And I really love them. I'm not entirely clear at this point if they are all available or some of them are available. I'll have to check, but The Coffin Trail would be the first one that you should look for. Now, one of the things I enjoy about the Rachel Savernake series, and it's important, I think, to understand them, is there's usually a map.
Yes.
So, it helps to orient yourself, often in the country, but this one is actually in London, right? No, it's in Rye.
Well, the story starts in London, but
no, but the map,
the map is the old town.
And the reason I know that is that I once spent an enjoyable stay in Rye at the Mermaid in Point of View.
Yes.
And that's where I learned that YPRES, which I would call Ypres Tower in British speak is called Wipers. And it is the scene of big World War I battle. I think Ypres in Belgium, isn't it?
It is. And Wipers was the joke. That was the soldiers' pronunciation.
Right.
What you're referring to is the tower, isn't it? The Mermaid Tower in
it's not that far from the Mermaid Tavern, which is an absolutely marvelous. It's up here, and the tavern is here. There's also, is it Henry James that has the home or has the home? There's exactly. A whole Yep,
Yeah.
literary thing. And Rye is in that part of marshy coastal country, which was huge in smuggling, especially during the end of the 18th century. But, you know, it was where an enormous amount of liquor passed back and forth. So, and down the road, not too far away, as you move west, you get to Brighton, but somewhere in there is big oyster country as well. So, you know, it's a great place to tour England. But if you do, stay at the Mermaid. And I remember I had a room that had a very low, the whole thing was all wood, had a very low ceiling, and there was there beams, and one of the beams had been hollowed out. There was a little door. So you could open it up and you could stash stuff inside one of these old beams. I think the tavern goes back, what, how long? Maybe,
Oh, it's incredible. It's one of the oldest in Britain.
yeah.
Uh, so it goes, I don't know, 13th century, 14th century, something like that. It's very, very old. I've stayed there twice. You're absolutely right. It's marvelous. It reeks of history, and it's definitely the place to stay. I would say in Rye, simply because there are several good places in Rye, very good places, but that history there on the
Right.
old the steep cobbled street. And I don't know whether you've come across this, Barbara. Probably you have, but there's an old novel, Golden Age novel, by David Frome or Zenith Brown, called Mr. Pinkerton at the Old Angel, and that's set in Rye. And the Old Angel is the mermaid.
It
So
is the mermaid. Well, I want to say for anybody who's contemplating staying that, people were much smaller back in the
yeah.
villages at all. Martin and I are small people, so it was a perfectly comfortable
I
place for us to stay. But if you're kind of basketball stature, I really can't recommend the mermaid.
know.
You should be knocking your head all the time on things. But it's a wonderful place for this book, which begins in an art gallery in London. So remind me, Martin, the surreal movement in art, was that very much a 1930s thing?
It had begun a bit earlier, and the funny thing is, I'm definitely no expert on art, but in the first book in the series, Gallows Court, I introduced references to Rachel's interest in surrealism, and that was just a passing thing. It was a tiny little element, and the curious thing is that in every book since then, including Hemlock Bay, book number 5, possibly Hemlock Bay more than any other book, the surrealist art thing has become a to me very interesting ingredient in the storyline. I've been able to do it without forcing it in. I've not needed to force it in because it's kind of emerged naturally, which from a writer's point of view is quite wonderful. It's fortuitous, it's
Mhm.
not planned, but it's just been the way that things have worked out so far. The exhibition that you're referring to at the start of what I still think of as Sepulchre Street, the house on Graveyard Lane. That's an exhibition staged by an artist called Damaris Gethin. And the strange thing that happened to me sometime after that book was published was that I received a message from someone called, guess what? Damaris Gethin. So, yeah, so, how on earth have you come to use my name in one of your books? So I explained, it's a long, complicated story, but there were reasons why I chose that particular name. And she was greatly entertained by it. But that it just shows you, yeah, you come up with a name that you think is very unusual, and then somebody else has been christened with it.
Even more astonishing is she read your book and recognized it. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
astonishing.
yeah. Maybe she Googled herself. I don't
I
know.
love it. Well, anyway, Damaris is a surrealist artist, and this gallery show involves surrealism. And present in this show is a guillotine that appears to be, excuse me, a guillotine that appears to be in working order. So, without revealing any spoilers, the guillotine, in fact, does its job. And Rachel then is has been tasked to solve the murder of the person executed by the guillotine, very neatly, I might say. And so that involves her eventually going to Rye.
That's exactly right. Perfect summary. And it's a combination. It's as in a lot of my novels. I think it's fair to say that things that happen are quite gruesome, but I don't like to describe them in a graphic way. So although in one sense these are very much not cozy stories, they're still stories I think that my late mother would have been quite happy reading from that point of view. So that's I don't sort of wallow in the gore, but there is a guillotining right at the start of the book.
Well, and you like to start your books with a fairly gruesome crime, consistent in these stories. So I've always been amazed back in the day. I mean, I know things have evolved, but I always recall that at one point P.D. James's books were described in Britain as cozies. There is absolutely, remember the one in the church where this church is like running with gore and all the
Yeah,
rest of it. And I thought there is, I mean,
it's
so
that
I think that in Britain, cozy really means traditional mystery. It doesn't mean
traditionalism much
or
better word.
sanitized or cats or anything. What it really means is that it's a detection. I mean, it's going to follow the kind of classic unspooling of the story that you would expect from an amateur sleuth or police procedure, which is basically it moves forward from whatever the instigating incident is to the conclusion. And, for the last 15 years or more, there's been this huge thing about domestic suspense and thrillers that have twists. And so the story doesn't move forward necessarily. It often zigzags back and forth. And the whole point of the book is not really the resolution of the crime, but rather the surprise, the shock. It always, I've been increasingly turned off by these books, and I have decided this is a thought that I'll share with you, and I've really been thinking about it, that this is in crime fiction, the sort of shock thing that current journalism is also deploying as a way to get people's attention to turn to reading it. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being shocked. And I'm also tired of reading books where I don't like anybody in them, where I just don't care about what happens. And, in your book, despite the things that happen here, we really care about Rachel. And we haven't talked about Jacob, but they're kind of a team. But if you really are in a world where everyone that you care about, everyone you associate with wants to betray you, I think that wears you out after a while.
That is the danger, Barbara. I agree that I think as authors we need to try to walk this line. It's inevitable in a crime novel that you'll have people doing bad things and people being suspected. So there will be troubled people in the story. But I think as a reader and a fan myself, like you do want to be able to latch on to, at the very, very least, one person that
Mhm.
whose fate you are kind of invested in, and that to me is important. Rachel isn't an obviously lovable character.
No.
She's definitely got a dark side, but I and she's definitely very ruthless. That is for sure. That's part of her DNA. But I've always found myself from when I first thought of the character and first wondered about writing about such a woman. I've always found her very fascinating and appealing in a mysterious sort of way, even from my perspective. And it's that sense of fascination that I try to introduce into the storylines, and it's the fascination that Jacob feels. He's intrigued. He doesn't fully understand what makes her tick, but he wants to find out. And he's drawn to her, but at the same time, she keeps him at a distance for a variety of reasons, some of which are not at all clear to him. So that kind of dynamic interests me, and I think that it does help me certainly to care about the characters, and so hopefully the readers will care about the characters.
Well, I think you've taken a lot of trouble, and it seemed more apparent in this book, although maybe, since I read so many books, I don't necessarily remember every bit of the earlier books, that you've taken care to explain how damaged she was by her father, a tyrannical judge. And she was basically kept prisoner, and in the end, she not only he's died, so she's been set free, but she has a considerable income. So, here she is, but it didn't happen to her until, years of this had. How old was she when her father died?
She was 25,
Right.
and there's a particular reason for that to do with inheritance. That's why she was 25. But yeah, so she's still even now in her mid-20s as Jacob is. So they are young people, finding their way in the world in a sense, as well as solving all these very, very intricate mysteries.
Well, that's very true. I mean, she is finding her way in the world, but there's a reason why her personality. I mean, there's been a lot of studies about, victims of abuse and what kind of um, damage is done to them, but also some of them, it gives them sort of an armor and even a weaponry, to tackle life if it hasn't actually broken them. And I think she falls into that category. She wasn't broken by him, but she's never really going to be a normal person.
No, that's exactly right. And she has these very protective colleagues, servants, apparently servants, Truman and his wife Hetty and his sister Martha, who is the sort of housemaid, but also Rachel's close friend. And that little group, bit by bit through the series, I'm developing them as characters as well. So we see more facets, whether it's Truman's mixology with the cocktails, or Martha's interest in Jacob, or whatever else it might be.
Well, one of the things that you also obviously interests you and is fun for the reader, and it's clear from the titles, is that you like to explore different parts of Britain, different landscapes, which in Britain means different cultures as well, particularly back in the 30s before, where there were still much more, if not dialect, at least regional accents and so forth. In fact, the way you title this series is much like the late Anne Perry titled her
Yeah.
for Thomas Pitt series. The titles all came from, I think they were almost all streets in London, if I remember,
Yes.
the Cater
Yes.
Street Hangman and so forth.
Yeah.
But so you're emphasizing the location
Yes.
of the story in the
Yes.
titles, and you're
Yes.
moving around, so you're
Yeah.
covering different parts of Britain.
That's right, and that's very deliberate. It's part of the original concept, because what I thought I would do in the early stages of this series was that because the books are a take on the golden age detective novel, but they're written today and they're not pastiches. So as you've said, they're Gothic golden age. That's absolutely right. So it's not, they're not written as Agatha Christie or Dorothy L. Sayers would have written them, because I'm writing them now with all that entails. But I thought right at the outset that it would be interesting and fun if each book were to have as its main setting a kind of archetypical golden age setting. So the first book, Gallows Court, that's in the centre of London, in legal London. Gallows Court is part of the Inns of Court in London. And the second book, Mortmain Hall, that was the country house kind of mystery. In the book, you don't actually get to Mortmain Hall until about 2/3 of the way through the story, but it's all heading in that direction right from the start. The third book, which in Britain is called Blackstone Fell, and in the States is called The Puzzle of Blackstone Lodge. That was the idea of the eerie, remote village, a village in Yorkshire, which I call Blackstone Fell, influenced by real life settings again, as were the other books. And the fourth book, the one we're talking about right now, Sepulchre Street, House on Graveyard Lane, that was the idea of the marsh, the mysterious, creepy marshland of Romney Marsh. And then Hemlock Bay, you've got the seaside and the hotel and things like that. So all of these are settings that we find in Golden Age books many, many times. And what I've tried to do in each of these books is to give a fresh take on that type of setting. And again, that's just another of the many ingredients in each novel. So each novel has quite a lot of different things going on. Some of them maybe not necessary. It's not necessary to pick them up if you're just reading casually, but they're there, and that interests me. This idea of weaving all these disparate elements together, and then trying to create a pretty intricate puzzle.
Right. Well, I mean, what we call Golden Age classics were written, as I already said, they weren't historical. They were written for a contemporary audience by people actually living in the time that they were writing about. So for Martin, what he's doing is he's writing stories in that particular world, but he's writing them actually as historical fiction, and that he has to look back. So I can only conclude, correct me if I'm wrong, that your long editorship at the British Library Crime Classics probably has shaped your interest and craft in writing these books.
Well, to a large extent, of course, as you know, I've been interested in this type of story since I was a child, since I discovered Agatha and Dorothy, and then in later years, but still pretty young, I discovered all the books that were out of print, or some of them, when I could find them, and so this interest goes back a long way, and I wrote a series, as you remember, my first series set in modern Liverpool.
That's right.
And the idea that the central idea of that series, the Harry Devlin books, was I'd have this gritty, modern, authentic urban setting, but I would have Golden Age plots. And I lavished a lot of care on those Golden Age plots, but the critics didn't really pick up on the Golden Age plots at all, because the Golden Age is out of fashion. And in the end, although those books did pretty well, I became frustrated by the fact that the Golden Age aspects were overlooked, and so I moved on and moved to the Lake District. Those books are written in a different way. It's more about the relationship between Daniel and Hannah and the rural setting, the nature of rural English society in the 21st century. That's what's going on there. But whilst I was writing the early Lake District books, I was also working on the book that became the Golden Age of Murder, non-fiction, but a book about all these books I loved, and the Detection Club. Although I started writing it before I was ever a member of the Detection Club. And that was a book which seemed not to be, maybe not even publishable, but certainly a tiny niche project when I started writing it, probably about 2005, something like that. I started writing it. And by the time it was published in 2015, of course, things had changed. The British Library series had begun. And all of a sudden, people were rediscovering the Golden Age. And so that book did much better than I or anybody else expected, which was lucky timing. So although those books in the 90s hadn't been particularly well timed for what I was trying to do, because I'd managed to survive long enough, eventually the wheel of fortune turns round, and now the appeal of golden age fiction, which I think for readers, for people like you and me, has always been there. But now the critics and the publishers are realizing, yeah, that there's a lot in these books, and so the fashion has changed in a good way.
Yes, but Martin, that is totally true of publishing. I mean, books cycle in and out of fashion. In the 90s, after I'd opened the bookstore, the two things that were the most in demand were A, historical fiction, because historical fiction had cycled out, and historical fiction writers decided they could write mystery with crime in it. Ellis Peters was a big help in that. And the other was the woman sleuth movement. It was authors like Sue Grafton and Marcia Muller and Sarah Paretsky who said, no, it doesn't always have to be, a Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler or even John Mead MacDonald kind of with a guy. It can, in fact, be a woman. And so people who are writing male private eye novels or ordinary thrillers all got frozen out of the market for quite a while. I remember male authors crying on my shoulder and saying they couldn't get published, because publishers only wanted the women's sleuth thing. And then it changed again, and then it changed again. We had Da Vinci clones, forever. We had religious conspiracy thrillers. It was about all you could get for 5 or 6 years. And then since Gone Girl in 2011, so it's been, 13 years or something, this whole idea of domestic suspense and betrayal and twists and the whole bit has dominated the market. But recently, coming into its own again, we find horror really big again, and the Gothic, which sort of goes along with horror, but also goes along with the golden age. And so the wheel is turned again, and the thing is, as you point out, you've lived long enough, and so where we come back into fashion. It's good for me to to really try to represent the tastes of all of our readers, because mine is increasingly out of fashion, but I keep hoping it will come back into fashion. So I have younger staff that are way better at connecting with fantasy. And do you even know the term cottagecore? Do you know what that means? Cottagecore.
No.
So we did an event, which has been very successful, for a new bestseller called Sarah Beth Durst. And she wrote a lovely book called The Spell Shop. And I realized that the descriptive word for it was cottagecore, which basically means a cozy fantasy.
Right. No,
I know, but what I'm saying is there's even a new vocabulary,
yeah.
so fantasy is now breaking off into subcategories. You have the sort of space opera, you have the Dungeons and Dragons, you have the medieval stuff. It's amazing how much fantasy is actually based on, the medieval world. It's just astonishing. And now we're getting, the cozy fantasy known as cottagecore. So it's this constantly evolving, and a lot of it is driven by social media, by TikTok groups and whatever it is. And I love the way that these readers are just so fascinated with it. I mean, they fill up the store so we're doing events I never would have even thought of when I started the store back in at the end of the 80s. And I love it. I mean, I think it's great. My concern is that I'm kind of left behind because, I'm still really more of a traditional mystery reader. So I'm forcing myself to catch up.
Excellent.
That's what I have to do. So the one last thing we need to talk about in regard to this series, the Puzzle of Blackstone Lodge and the House on Graveyard Lane in particular, is the clue finder. And the clue finder is a golden age trope that Martin is restoring. So tell us about it. I went through it and read it's right here, several pages in the back, actual page reference numbers. Tell us what the clue finder is all about.
Yeah, well, the clue finder came into existence in the late 1920s. A writer called J.J. Cunnington, who's a very big name at that time in Britain. He probably produced the first clue finder. And it spun out of this idea of the detective story as a challenge to the reader. which was an idea not just in Britain but also the States with Ellery Queen, who had explicit challenges to the reader at the end of the book. You've reached the last but one chapter, so can you answer the following question? And this idea of the game: can the reader solve the mystery before the great detective reveals all? Very much dependent on fair play, putting the clues in the text but misdirecting. Very appealing. And Agatha Christie didn't do it explicitly, but she did it implicitly in the way that she wrote. And quite a number of authors, both in Britain and in the States, used the idea of the clue finder. And what they were trying to do was to demonstrate precisely how fair they were being in their use of fair play detection by pointing out the pages, the lines in the phrases in the text that contain the clues. And there were writers like John Dixon Carr, had a number of clue finders. Edmund Crispin, who's a good friend of Dixon Carr, he did them as well. There's an American writer called C. Daly King, who was very, very big on clue finders, had some very elaborate clue finders. And it was all about playing fair, so that you get to the end of the book and the solution's revealed, and then you can score yourself as a reader, see how many of the clues that you spotted. So it was a game, really. It's a puzzle. It was all part of the fun. And those books continued to be written really until the beginning of the 50s. Carr and Crispin were still using them then. And then they kind of vanished. And I thought that if I was writing a modern version of Golden Age story, because I've always liked clue finders, it would be good to revive the clue finder and again show I was playing fair with the reader, because these are complex mysteries, and I hope they're not too easy to solve, but not impossible either. But I wanted to give some precise illustrations of where in the story the relevant pieces of information were hidden. So that's how it works, and they're a lot of fun to create, I must say.
Well, they are, and actually it's fun to go back and check yourself. So I'll just read one, won't give anything away here. On page 31, the clue finder is, I did her a good turn once. I did her a good turn once. So if you're paying attention, you have to ask yourself, what might that good turn have been at that point in the story, which is fairly early on. Page 31. Do you know my all-time favorite clue finder thing? And I cannot remember what story it was, but Dorothy Sayers, very proud of, having attended whichever, was it Somerville College at Oxford? Even, before women were allowed to give degrees and all, was fluent in French. And she expected her readers to be able to read French if it appeared in her books without any translation. And one of her short stories, I do not remember which, there is a moment in conversation in French where a pronoun is used that is not the pronoun applying to the sex of the person in question. And only if you know French would you have then at that moment said, wait, it was ça instead of son. I can't remember exactly what it was. And you would have then said to yourself, this person is in disguise as a woman. Because
that's right. That's one of the Whimsy short stories, isn't it?
I think it was, yeah. But I mean, when I realized, because, I actually majored in French at Stanford. And so, while I'm not fluent anymore, at least I am fluent reading it, even if conversation is what's hard if you don't actually practice the language, but you can keep the reading skill. But I remember I read through that paragraph and then I went, wait, and I went back and looked again and I thought, is that a typo? And then I thought about it and I said, no, I said, it's a clue. It's a clue. What this means is this is a cross-dressing person. I thought that was such a great example of a fair play moment. But the problem, of course, is that only a very few people would have been able to think of, wouldn't have even noticed it. He was a little too esoteric.
Yes, it's comparable. I think there's an Agatha Christie, a murder is announced, where there's a typographical thing
Mhm.
that you think is just a printer's error, but it isn't. It's a clue.
Right.
That's the same concept. I think
Yeah, no, it really is. And, I do think it emphasized, and that's a sort of a tenet of the Detection Club, of which Martin is the president, that, the idea of the Playfair mystery and the challenge to the reader and Father Knox's list of, the 10 things you can't do, no doppelgangers and so forth, which I might say was completely violated in A Test of Will. So a huge hit by Charles Todd. And there was, believe me, there was a doppelganger in play there. And I love the fact that they broke, Father Knox's rule to so much success. So Ian, come and tell us whether, because I was late in notifying everybody that we were doing this, I hate Microsoft. It decided to reboot my computer and just shattered a number of shortcuts that I had for writing our newsletter. Anyway, so I realize that many of you are going to be watching this after the conversation is concluded, but still, anybody there, Ian?
Yes, there's a few questions here.
Oh,
The first
good.
question can be for both of you. Do you see readership staying higher since the pandemic?
Barbara, what are your thoughts as a book
Well,
seller?
yes, I do. I think people got there. It's not just the pandemic. There have been studies that have shown that when digital reading and so forth came in, ebooks and all, it was really exciting for people. It was something new, it was convenient and all. But people at that point still were not spending their working lives on screens. And so today, when everybody is forced to work on screens, such as Martin and he and I are doing at the moment, people are turning back to print as, relaxation and whatever. And there are studies that show that reading in print is much more satisfying and more, you retain it better. It's certainly true for me that reading in print, I can recall things, and if I see it scroll by, it goes away. So I think that those are factors in addition to the fact that the pandemic brought people back to reading because they had more leisure time, back to the classics. And then I think there's an economic component. I think other forms of entertainment have become incredibly expensive. And while the price of books has gone up higher than I would like, if you go to Disneyland, if you want to go to the movies and have popcorn, if you want to attend a sporting event, if you travel, the prices are just astronomical. So really, a book is like the best dollar value you can find. And it's not disposable. When you're done with it, you can give it to somebody else. You can put it on a shelf and reread it. So I do think that there's an economic value and that people are searching for entertainment or passing the time in a way that makes more sense with their money.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect answer. I can't add to it. I think you're absolutely right on every point.
And I'm really fascinated that the attention to the classics has remained so high. I don't know, Ian, you don't probably look at the restock reports at the store, but I have to do them all the time. And a very large section every single time of the books that sold over the last few days are classics. And then the question comes, what's a classic? How do we define it? Is it just a time frame? Or, what's the difference between Cormac McCarthy and Moby Dick? Where do we draw the line? But I'm really cheered by the fact that I think that people are exploring classics, are reading the British Library crime classics and all, and becoming grounded in the fiction, and that will entice them to read more. That's a long answer, but that's how I feel. Sorry. What else, Ian?
For Martin, how many books have you written that have been published in the US?
Thanks. I've published 8 books in the Lake District series, all of which are in the States. The Rachel books are all in the States. In my first series, I think 3, 4 of those 8 have been in the States. So 4 were, 4 aren't. But they're now available as ebooks or print on demand. but originally 4 of the 8 were published in the States. And I also wrote a couple of standalones quite a long time ago now, both of which were published in the States. So nearly all of them, with 4 exceptions in the very first series, the Liverpool series. So and some of those, the hardbacks will be out of print now, but they're all relatively easy to obtain online.
Right, and we haven't really talked about Martin's nonfiction. He referenced one of them, The Golden Age of Murder, but The Story of Classic Crime in 100 Books and The Life of Crime are all available here. So, Martin's a real scholar of, you probably gathered from this conversation, of crime fiction. I think Harry Keating was kind of the torch passed, I thought, from Harry to you.
Yes, well, it'd be nice from my point of view to think so. Yeah, and The Life of Crime is the paperback edition of that is coming out, which is pretty extensively updated and expanded. It has come out in Britain and is coming out in the States, I think, either just before or probably just after Christmas.
Right, and I didn't mention that Martin has won Edgar Awards, Anthony Awards, and Agatha Awards for his nonfiction.
Do you have any plans for touring the US anytime soon?
Well, I'm coming to Nashville next week for VoucherCon, and that's the only thing in the diary in terms of the States at the moment. But obviously, of course, the opportunities to go to the States are relatively limited. But whenever I get the chance, I'm delighted to come along. And of course, I visited your wonderful store on quite a number of occasions over the years, and that's been fantastic.
We might be able to lure him back to a Left Coast Crime at some point. And I don't know if you've ever toured Canada, but BoucherCon is going to take place in Calgary in either 26 or 27. I think next year it's in New Orleans. This year it's in Nashville. And I can't remember whether it's then Washington, D.C. and then Calgary, or then Calgary, Washington, D.C.
Calgary in 26 and Washington.
Ah, okay. So maybe Calgary, which I'm excited about. I'm definitely going.
Right, yeah. So yes, I've not thought that far ahead. Yeah, exciting.
What type of law do you practice?
I have done some company and commercial work many years ago, but my main area is employment law, or labor law, as it's called in the States. That was what I did. I'm now very, very part-time as a consultant, but for many years I was full-time partner, and that was my field. And I did write books on the law. So I've written books about, I wrote my very first book, I have here was this one, which I don't recommend anybody to read. It was written more than 40 years ago. When I was pretty young, but I've written a number of legal books, equal opportunities being the main subject. I wrote a book on that which went into 4 editions, each one bigger than the last as the law got bigger. But that was something I enjoyed greatly. But of course, my focus now is on crime writing.
Speaking to having maps in books, do authors like having them, or are they an additional burden to the publishing process?
I love them, and I'm fortunate that my wife's an artist, an amateur artist, and so she does the maps. So and she's drawn maps for quite a few of my books, both Lake District books and the Rachel Savern series.
And finally, a question for Barbara. From the bookshelves that we can see behind you, what's your favorite book?
Oh, I'd never be able to answer that, but I can tell you a current favorite book that I meant to mention to Martin, so pay attention. Martin mentioned The Inns of Court is where Gallows View, or no, sorry, what's it called?
Gallows Court.
Thank you. Gallows Court takes place. So when I was in London in June on the Sunday, I wandered all over after lunch at the Royal Covent Garden Opera House. And because there was a huge parade going on, I went down to the embankment to avoid the giant parade on what is it, Fleet Street? But anyway, so I'm walking along the embankment and I suddenly realized that to my left were the Inns of Court. There's a garden and there were metal railings and, all kinds of emblems and stuff. And so it was a slow Sunday, so I wandered up. I could get in sort of a byway and almost up to Fleet Street. You could get in. And the very nice man who was on duty, because it was a quiet day, because I looked harmless, let me in. And so the Inns of Court are absolutely fabulous, but there is a new mystery, which I have imported, which I want Martin to read. He will love it, by Sally Smith, who is in fact a barrister who still lives in the Inns of Court. It's called Of Mice and Murder. It takes place in 1901. The Lord Chief Justice, who was there, is murdered, found only wearing his socks rather than shoes. Well, he had other clothes on, but basically his socks. And a hapless kind of a backroom lawyer, we would call him, but a guy whose real knowledge of the law is the big thing going for him, is blackmailed by or pressured by the treasurer of the inn into working this case. And I'm telling you, it's wonderful. But have you run across it?
I haven't, but one of the reasons I'm interested is my son's a barrister nowadays, and he practices in the Inns of Court, in not in the Temple where you were, but across the road in Lincoln's Inn, which is also a great
It
location.
is. Well,
And Lincoln's Inn was the setting for the gallows court.
Well, there's handy maps inside the book. It's published by Bloomsbury, but I'm telling you, it was wonderful. And it reminds me a lot of Sarah Caldwell's wonderful books, her
Yeah.
4 books, which involve barristers in the Inns of Court in Oxford. So that's my current favorite book, right? Of Mice and Murder.
Fantastic. Yes, The World of Chance. Sarah Caldwell, another great writer.
And her books have just been brought back into print in this
Oh,
country,
right,
which I'm
right.
really happy about, because she won the 2000 Anthony Award for her 3rd book. And then she died some years later, not too long afterward.
Yeah.
So, long answer to a question. Ian, thank you very much for sitting through this. Thank you all for watching it. If you know anybody that missed it, this video will live forever on Facebook and YouTube, and there will eventually be a podcast. In the meantime, The House on Graveyard Lane, I think it actually publishes next week, if I remember right, on Tuesday, I think. But anyway, we have copies of The Poison Pen, and I urge you to grab one. It's a different reading experience, as Martin says, not a cozy, but a gothic. So bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks, Barbara.
A pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks very much.